a lot of people perceive these situations to be the most high risk. That's actually a really small percentage of what we do. Most of what we do is helping someone who is maybe in the process of leaving, but they're not in that immediate danger, or they're kind of struggling with the aftermath of being assaulted weeks or months or years ago. It's not always, even though we are a crisis agency, it doesn't always have to be, and it's very rarely the level 10 crisis that we see and kind of deal with.
Before we dive in, it's important to remember that the information we provide is for informational purposes only. Every situation is unique, and decisions regarding your health or legal matters should be made after consulting with your own doctor or lawyer. Our aim is to inform and empower, but personal circumstances require personalized advice. Hi, welcome to another edition of Justice in Scrubs. I'm attorney Richard Hastings, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Dr. Jeff Michaelis.
And today we are joined by a very special guest, Ann Cara Durling, who is the Chief Program Officer for the Center for Empowerment and Education.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start by you giving us a little background and what got you on this journey?
Yeah. So thank you for having us on this podcast, this opportunity to share kind of this platform. I'm really excited. I can be a bit chatty, so feel free to also let me know if we need a segue.
You might have met your match in me.
But I love talking about this, so I'm really excited. So me personally, I actually got involved in this work. I've been in the nonprofit sector and kind of interpersonal violence field for a little over a decade. I've been at the Center for Empowerment and Education for about 8.5 years, so a lot of my time in this field has been at this agency. I started my work when I was actually in high school. I saw a lot of my family, friends who were impacted by domestic violence or sexual violence, and I grew up in Weston, Connecticut, so not too far from here. Very much a town that was like, this doesn't happen here. This couldn't happen to anyone we know. And so I became very passionate very quickly about making sure that people were aware about these issues and that there was help out there. So I started my journey in high school, became kind of co-president of my local club to raise awareness for teen dating violence, then did my undergrad at University of Rhode Island where I was a peer advocate. So I did a lot of counseling, advocacy, education programs and presentations for my campus community. Interned at a state coalition for domestic violence, worked down in Florida with survivors of sex trafficking, and then found my way back up to Connecticut for the Center for Empowerment and Education, where I started as a prevention educator and now serve as the Chief Program Officer. So
wow.
It's been a fun and amazing journey, but this work has been, for me personally, a part of my life, a huge part of my life and my passion.
New topic. Did you know Keith Richards' daughters?
No, but I worked at a local pharmacy, and I would see a lot of celebrities kind of coming in every once in a while, but obviously confidentiality. I couldn't always disclose who I would see coming in.
So why don't you talk about the center? What is the center? What does the center do? Who comes to the center?
Yeah. So we are a local nonprofit organization located in Danbury, but we serve 11 of our surrounding towns. And we are a member center of both the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence. So we are a state-certified organization providing services to victims and survivors of interpersonal violence. So that includes domestic violence or teen dating violence, family violence, intimate partner violence. There's lots of different versions and forms of what that can look like, as well as sexual violence, stalking, human trafficking, etc. All of our services are provided at no cost. We are confidential, so we're state-certified counselors, and we provide anything from counseling and advocacy and crisis intervention and support to our prevention education and community support, as well as a shelter for those fleeing violence and needing a safe place to stay. So lots of different services. That's kind of a quick overview, but I'm happy to get into more details.
So if you could break that down, I don't know if you can or you can't.
Yes.
So domestic violence, sexual violence, sex trafficking, what groups of people come in and what percentages?
Yeah, so we typically see more so of domestic violence coming in. It's about 75% when we know. So sometimes people call our hotline and they don't always disclose what they've experienced directly. So when we know the type of perpetration that they've experienced, we've captured that data to show that typically around 75% of the clients that we serve are experiencing domestic violence. And then about 25 have experienced sexual violence. But that also, a lot of our clients experience both. So they might be in an abusive marriage or relationship where they're being assaulted or raped by their partner or their spouse or something of that sort, or they'd experienced sexual violence prior. So they have a history of both.
So let's talk about the domestic violence part of it. Is this in lieu of the police getting involved? Is it normally before the police get involved? Is it normally after the police get involved?
Great question. So we work in partnership with our local law enforcement. We're really fortunate to have a really positive relationship with all of the police departments in our area. And so there's a couple of ways that we kind of work with law enforcement. It's really up to the client in terms of if they want to report or not what they've experienced. So we as advocates never tell someone, you have to report this, you should report this. It's completely up to them in what they decide to do next, and then we can inform them of their options. If they decide that is something they want to report, we can accompany them, provide information, support, kind of help them navigate the criminal justice system because it's complicated and, overwhelming for a lot of people. And so part of that is working with our local law enforcement. We actually have an office that we've been given from the Danbury Police Department. So we have an advocate who is stationed there a couple of days a week so that when victims come in to make a report, we already have an advocate right there to be able to provide that support. So law enforcement has been incredibly welcoming to bring us in early on from the minute someone wants to make a report, but we can obviously be involved even before that to see if that's an option they want to pursue. Another huge part of our partnership with law enforcement is a program called the Lethality Assessment Program.
Say it again.
Lethality Assessment Program, or LAP. So this is a program that's not unique to Danbury or even Connecticut. It's actually something that started back in the 80s that was really founded in research on intimate partner homicide. So looked at what were the common denominators for mainly women that were murdered by their intimate partners and what were those factors. And so they created a screening tool that law enforcement could use to, when they respond to an incident of domestic violence, that they can assess if this person is in a potentially lethal situation. And what the program does is if they screen in, answering yes to a certain number of questions, that triggers a protocol where law enforcement connect immediately to our agency or their local domestic violence agency. And that way the victim can immediately safety plan with an advocate and figure out their next steps. And that has proven to actually reduce intimate partner homicides by having that partnership and connection.
Do you know what those are? The LAP criteria?
Yeah. So off the top of my head, there's
like, do you have a gun?
Questions. Yep. So it's, do they have access to a firearm? Have they ever threatened to kill you?
Mental health?
Something about controlling behaviors. Do they control like aspects of your life? Have they lost a job recently? So there's a lot of different.
Drug and alcohol abuse.
I don't remember if drug and alcohol abuse is on it. But I know there's like a section in the beginning that's 3 questions. And if they answer yes to one of those questions, it automatically triggers the protocol. And then the remaining are kind of more.
Have they threatened to kill you?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I hate to use the word typical, but I want to get kind of the typical person.
Sure.
So the typical person is a female that is abused physically by the male, and then they typically report this to the police and the other person is arrested?
No. So there is no typical. I'm sorry to give like such a great answer, but
it's like a lawyer.
I know.
It depends.
It really depends. So every person's experience is different. But I'm glad that you brought up the physical abuse because that is kind of the common perception is that when we hear domestic violence or intimate partner violence, we automatically assume there's some kind of physical abuse happening. That's not always the case. A lot of times we see what's called coercive control when someone is controlling different aspects of their life, controlling or monitoring their spending, a lot of financial abuse that might be happening, emotional abuse. So insulting that person, putting them down, really harming their self-esteem and sense of self-worth. It could be stalking, so utilizing technology to track their location, to monitor who they're communicating with, limiting access to their finances or their bank accounts, or it could be sexual abuse. So it's not always going to be like a black eye that you see in the media. It can look really different depending on the person. And I would say not that most don't report it, but it's actually really not as common as people think to report to law enforcement for either domestic or sexual violence. Sexual violence in particular is one of the most underreported crimes.
So, and I don't practice this kind of law, but it was my understanding years and years and years ago that you could not be arrested for sexually assaulting your spouse.
Yeah. Up until the 80s, it was not illegal to rape your spouse.
And that has since changed.
Well, not illegal, yeah.
Yeah. So it is illegal to rape a spouse, and you can absolutely report that as a crime.
Every state, or is that a federal thing? Or
So I believe it's federal. I want to say that the FBI actually changed their definition of rape back in the kind of mid-'80s. And the 80s was really a time where a lot of these kind of grassroots organizations started to pop up. A lot of these organizations that didn't exist before. We were founded in 1975. So the 70s and 80s were where a lot of the awareness was starting to happen in the communities. It was very much treated as like this is a private matter, this is a family matter. And so the 80s was that time where a lot of the laws started to change. We started to see...
Isn't that Tracy Thurman was back in the 80s?
Yep, exactly. And then in the 90s, we saw VAWA, or the Violence Against Women Act. So there were a lot that started to kind of pick up traction in the 80s and 90s to start addressing this at a federal level, and then, of course, kind of trickling down to the states.
So it would appear to me that if you report a sexual violence or you report a domestic incident to the police, they come out and they have to arrest the other person.
Yes, we do have a mandated arrest law here in Connecticut.
So what percentage of those people, the abused spouse, what percentage of those just go home?
It depends. Sorry. It depends on the situation. So if they are arrested on site, the perpetrator or the abuser, sometimes they want to go back home to be safe that night, but they may speak to an advocate and, try to figure out their next steps of how to get out of that situation. Not everybody who's in an abusive relationship, this sounds a little counterintuitive, but not everybody wants to leave the relationship even if there's abuse. They just want the abuse to stop.
There's some kind of sick dynamic with... And you see it in these made-for-TV movies where...
Like the Stockholm thing, right?
The Stockholm Syndrome.
Well, that and a lack of resources. Sometimes people don't realize how financially burdensome it is if that person, let's say they're married. We'll just use that as an example. And their partner has controlled all their finances. They've sabotaged their ability to work. We've seen that where sometimes they will... I remember a case years ago that a colleague of mine was working on where the abuser would hide their car keys from them in the morning so that they were consistently late to work, and they eventually got fired because of this. And so now they had limited access to income. Their partner was controlling all the finances, wouldn't let them have access to that. They would ruin their credit. So then how are they going to apply for an apartment? How are they going to get a credit card in their own name? So it's actually the financial abuse is often one of the biggest barriers for people leaving, even if they quote unquote want to leave.
Well, I think another huge barrier is the fact that for many people, with two spouses working, they can afford one household, but the two spouses can't afford two separate households.
Right.
Which has nothing to do with kind of going in and doing things to their credit and their work history and things like that.
Yeah. And in addition to that, the fear is really valid too. So if we are looking at physical violence or stalking, leaving an abusive relationship is statistically the most dangerous time. That's often when escalated violence may occur.
Sure.
That if you look at the headlines we've had, unfortunately, many intimate partner homicides here in our area just in the past few years. And if you look at them, most of the time, it's when they were getting a restraining order, they were in the process of leaving, or had recently left. So oftentimes, these situations are rooted in power and control. So the abuser is losing that power when the victim is saying, I'm leaving. And so that can escalate the situation to sometimes lethal or fatal situations.
And when you say intimate partner, does that mean unmarried people, or that means married and unmarried?
Either, yeah.
Okay.
Now, if they want to leave, what happens? They say to you, I want to leave.
Yeah.
What happens after that?
So we are what's called client-centered. So it's every single person's situation is going to be unique. So we will look and ask them, right? Treat them as the expert in their own lives because they're the ones who have to live their life, right? We're not going to tell them this is what you have to do or should do. We're going to ask them what is feasible to you? What is your goal? What can we help you do to get closer to that goal? So they might look at financial independence before they even think about leaving the relationship because they need to be able to secure, right, their own income to afford their mortgage or rent or whatever it may be. Or it could be, I want to wait until our kids are graduated from high school before we, look at this situation to get myself out of it. So it really depends on the person, but we do what's called safety planning. So it's a collaborative effort with the client to say, what are the different things that we need to put in place? So that could be things like packing what we call a go bag. So this could be essential items, documents, medication, clothing in a bag that they can keep stowed away in their trunk of their car or somewhere where the abuser may not be able to see it easily so that if things escalate, they can escape out of that situation quickly. And then that's more kind of the immediate. And then the long term would be, okay, where can you stay? Who can you stay with? How long? We do have a shelter, so that is another option if that feels, feasible to them or that's the only option that they have. But a lot of times people don't want to go into a shelter, right? They want to stay with a family member or stay with a friend or other options, even
but
if
there
it
is
means
a shelter
moving out of
there
state.
to help, just in case.
Yes, we do have a shelter for anyone who's fleeing violence or needs a safe place to stay.
And then what percentage of, we'll call them the victims, what percentage of the victims have children?
I don't know off the top of my head how many have children, but I would say if we're just looking at the shelter, it's probably about half.
So you have somebody come into your office who's been the victim of some type of abuse, and they have children, and they don't want to return home, and they don't have any place to go. You'll put them in a shelter for how long?
It depends on the situation. Sorry, I'm going to say
These
that
are
a
great
lot.
answers.
Yeah.
Do you have a law degree?
Maybe. So it's totally dependent on the person and their situation. We have a lot of undocumented people in the shelter. And so getting them either documentation or securing housing, they will most likely have additional barriers to securing that. So it might take them a little bit longer than someone who is documented. It depends on, where they want to go, if they want to stay within Connecticut or they want to relocate to another state, if they need to secure a job first. There's so many different factors, but, it can be anywhere from a month to several months that they're in shelter,
let's say I'm
a night or a couple of weeks.
Let's say I'm a victim, right? And I've had it, and I want help.
Yeah.
I've been abused last night or something. Do I call the police? Do I call you? How should I access the resources that you provide?
I can answer that. It depends.
I would say if it's an emergency, we are not, right, we are a crisis organization, but if they need immediate help, right, 911, of course, if that feels like a safe option for them. If we operate 24/7, so we have our hotlines that are available 24/7, and we can respond to either the hospital or law enforcement 24/7 as well. So if someone calls us at 2 a.m. saying, this just happened, they left the house, I need to get out of here, they can call us for that. If they're in immediate danger or need medical attention, of course, we're always going to refer them to 911 for that support. But if they need to physically get out of there right in that moment, we can help them safety plan and figure out their options.
And what's your phone number? Is there a website to get you, or what?
Yes.
Tell us
so
about that.
we have our main phone number. So our business kind of operates 9 to 5, right, during the week. But our hotlines are available 24/7. So we have a domestic violence hotline that's actually statewide, and they'll connect to their local domestic violence agency. So our hotline for that is 203-731-5206. And then we have our sexual assault hotline that's also 24/7. So again, if someone is sexually assaulted and they are trying to figure out what their options are, if they decide they want to go to the hospital, we can accompany them 24/7. But they can call that hotline, which is 203-731-5204. And then our website is thecenterct.org.
So I would think, just guessing, that you're going to be busiest at night.
Actually, no.
Really?
So I'm really glad I'm so happy you asked that question or kind of made that comment. A lot of people perceive these situations to be the most high risk. That's actually a really small percentage of what we do. Most of what we do is helping someone who is maybe in the process of leaving, but they're not in that immediate danger, or they're kind of struggling with the aftermath of being assaulted weeks or months or years ago. It's not always, even though we are a crisis agency, it doesn't always have to be, and it's very rarely the level 10 crisis that we see and kind of deal with. So again, day to day, there is no typical day, but on any given day, we could be accompanying, going to what it's called an MIT, so multi-interdisciplinary investigative team. So this is comprised of law enforcement, family and children's aid, DCF, a forensic medical examiner, advocate, et cetera, when a child has been sexually assaulted or experienced some kind of violence. There is one interview that takes place to reduce the amount of times that a child has to repeat the trauma they've experienced. So we, at any given day, could be responding to an MIT. We could be going to the hospital for a client. We could be providing counseling services for someone. We could be helping someone, enter shelter services, or we could be doing our community education program. So we do a lot of our programs out in the schools on a day-to-day basis, from pre-K all the way through 12th grade.
So a lot of preventative stuff.
Exactly.
And empowerment.
Yes.
You want to talk about that?
Yes.
That's the empowerment part.
Love it. Our name is very suited for what we do. So that was the intention behind it. Those are the two core pieces of our work. We empower survivors and clients to find their own path toward healing, whatever that looks like for them. And we educate the community so that we can prevent these issues from happening in the first place. So our education programs are tailored and meet the state standards for sexual violence prevention, all of that. So we provide from pre-K all the way through 12th grade, from any topic from bodily autonomy, healthy relationships, conflict resolution, boundaries, to consent, sexual violence, dating violence.
So you go to the schools.
Yep. Yeah. So we partner with a lot of schools. I think it's close to 40 because we're in 11 towns. So we're in a lot of the elementary schools, most of the middle schools, I believe all, or at least almost all of the high schools in our area. And we'll provide programs to anyone who wants one or needs one.
So I was discussing this with you earlier. My question is, why is the school not doing that?
So some of them supplement our programs, but they trust us and want to bring in experts on this specific topic. So
what is did you say bodily autonomy? Mm-hmm. What is that?
So, for example, for the little ones, so if we're going into kindergarten or first grade, we have a program that's based off of a book called You're the Boss, or Who's the Boss of This Body. So it's introducing the concept of consent, but not in a sexual situation. So engaging kids with the concept and idea that they own their body, that they can say no to things that make them uncomfortable or feel unsafe. So a lot of people are familiar with more like safe touch, unsafe touch conversations. So we kind of introduce that concept of, if you are a child and you experience this, like, adults should not be engaging in this behavior with you.
And that's not taught in, I don't even know where health class starts, but that's not taught in schools?
No. So Connecticut now requires this type of education, but most schools rely on and want their local sexual assault or domestic violence agency to come in to provide it.
So what would be taught in the middle school, for example?
Yeah. So anything from conflict resolution, boundaries. So we'll kind of, again, introduce the concept of consent in different scenarios. So we'll even talk about, silly examples to just kind of introduce the concept of, if someone takes a fry off of your plate without asking, how does that make you feel?
Oh, interesting.
So it introduces the concept and then engages to give them skills and techniques to be able to advocate for themselves, right? Say no when they don't want something, but also that it teaches people to ask and respect people's boundaries. So we're not just preventing victims from becoming victims, because that's really not the purpose
That's
of
the empowerment
prevention.
part.
Exactly. We're also teaching people the skills to engage in healthy behaviors so that they choose to be respectful. They choose to, engage in healthy conflict resolution. So we talk about healthy relationships early on and consent early on.
We wanted to take a quick break to remind you about our sponsor, findagreatattorney.com. Dealing with the aftermath of an accident or injury can be overwhelming. And the last thing you want to worry about is finding the right lawyer. Findagreatattorney.com simplifies the process by connecting you with one of the top attorneys in your area who specializes in your specific type of case. Whether you've been injured in a car accident, suffered a slip and fall, or experienced medical malpractice, findagreatattorney.com has a network of experienced lawyers ready to help. And remember, their service is completely free, so you can focus on your recovery without worrying about the cost of legal representation. If you or someone you know needs legal assistance, don't hesitate to visit findagreatattorney.com and let them match you with one of the best lawyers in your area for your needs.
Speaking of skills, fairly recently, I'm a primary care physician, and we have these obligated CMEs, called continuing medical education. And fairly recently, one of them was about abuse.
Yeah.
And there's some questions that we were trained to ask.
Yes.
But I don't think the questions are really, after speaking to you, I don't think they're comprehensive enough.
Agreed.
Okay, yeah.
We actually train medical professionals as well. So we offer, in addition to our programs for youth, we do professional trainings in the community. And one of my favorite populations is working with medical providers. So we have different kind of screening tools and techniques that we can provide some insight on how to frame the screening questions, when and how to screen patients.
Is very important, yes.
And then the different types of questions. So yeah, we often hear, are you safe at home, or do you feel safe at home?
Right.
And that's actually an outdated screening tool.
Right. So can we role play here a little bit?
Sure.
Okay. Let's say you come in, you're depressed, you're anxious, and I might want to ask those questions, right? Now, let me be the victim and let you be the doctor.
Okay.
And what kind of questions should you ask me?
Yeah.
In regards to that?
So I would say, as a practice that we've started to engage in here at hospital, at
right.
facility, we've started asking all of our patients about the impact on their health as it relates to relationships. So we know that relationships can have a huge impact on our health. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Is that okay?
Right.
And then I would say...
That's very important. That's what we do. Don't put them on edge or something.
Yeah.
Say that we do this to everybody.
Exactly.
So they're not uncomfortable.
Not just people that you think might be at risk, because you really don't know who might be impacted by it. So we've started asking all of our patients. And then you would frame the question, is there anyone in your life who is hurting or threatening you in any way? That's kind of the updated version of the do you feel safe at home? Because we know it doesn't always happen at home. And safety is really subjective. Someone might be thinking physical safety, and they may not be thinking about the emotional abuse or sexual abuse that they experienced. So is there anyone in your life that's hurting or threatening you in any way? Or the additional question is a little more direct, is have you ever had an unwanted sexual experience? And that kind of keeps it a little vague, bigger question, but you framed it as this is something we're asking all our patients because we know it can have a large impact on your health.
Right. Now, you also were talking about financial control, and I've never thought to ask that question.
Yeah.
But that's probably almost as important as the first two questions, right? And how would you ask that?
So as healthcare providers, we don't expect you to have to go into the details about, identifying what type of abuse they're experiencing. If you suspect or confirm, maybe a patient discloses, right, that they have experienced some kind of abuse, at that point, the referral is really the most important thing that you can do as a provider.
Right.
Because you have to do your job in treating them and attending to their medical needs. So we don't expect you to then be their counselor and their advocate and all those other pieces that we can provide.
But we're also more obligated to do social determinants of health. That's the big thing now.
Yeah.
So one of the social determinants of health is financial. So they might say no to the first two, but you probably want to open up the door about someone controlling you financially, because the financial thing can then lead into more sexual abuse, I assume.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
I assume that starts first, or who knows where first.
Yeah.
It depends.
It depends.
It depends.
It's going to be the title of this podcast. It depends.
Can you sort of talk about that? How is it financial first and then sexual second, or physical? Or is it, that kind of thing?
So, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that there could be one form of abuse happening in any given relationship or multiple. It can be layered. But I would say actually the more common, it's going to be uncommon to find an abusive relationship that doesn't involve some level of the emotional abuse. So that's the insults, put downs, breaking down their self-esteem, making them feel worthless. They're really trying to make them feel like they don't deserve any better, or that you can try to leave, but no one will ever love you, or no one's going to want to be with you. Yeah. You're damaged goods, whatever. They're going to say things. So this is also called verbal abuse, depending on how people look at it or experience it. And that, I would say, it would be rare to not see that aspect. All the other forms, it depends on the situation or the person. Right. So we might see physical violence or not. We might see financial abuse or not. You might see some statistics out there. I've seen some that say how financial abuse is in 99% of domestic violence cases. I don't know if I can confirm that locally in kind of what we see, but it is certainly a huge barrier for people who are trying to leave an abusive situation.
So we're obligated reporters, right? Mm-hmm. So sometimes we are obligated to report, but sometimes it hasn't reached that level.
Yeah.
So let's say we're concerned about somebody, but it hasn't reached a level of physical abuse. Mm-hmm. Should we call? Should they call? Or should we give them resources to call? Or what? How should we handle that?
Yeah.
Because obviously, if it's reached the obligation, we would just call social services.
Right. Follow whatever protocols.
Right,
yeah,
right.
exactly.
But if we're not there yet, if there hasn't been physical abuse, but we're concerned that it's escalating or getting up there, what would you recommend that we do at that point?
Depending on your relationship, I changed the wording a little. Depending on your relationship with that patient, there's a couple options. So you can offer to give them the information. And I will say too, this is kind of, I think sometimes people expect victims who have experienced violence to be ready to report it or ready to talk about it. A lot of them aren't. So they might not even be receptive to receiving help at that moment. So that's why we kind of like to frame it too as if you ever know someone who could benefit from these services, I'd love to give you their card or their phone number just in case. So it's a little less direct because sometimes they're not quite ready to hear that. They're not quite ready to reach out for help. There's a lot of shame, especially what we see with male survivors, as we were kind of talking about prior to recording about there's a lot of stigma for men who've experienced abuse or rape or any of those issues. So to kind of use the indirect approach of, hey, I'm going to give you this information just in case, and a reminder that they're confidential, they don't cost anything, they're here for you 24/7. So you can offer that information, or you can offer to call with them, right, depending on what they're looking for in that moment. If they are really receptive to receiving that help, you could always call our hotline and with them
And I think the challenge is, I don't want to generalize, but I will. In every single relationship, there is abuse. You get into an argument with your significant other or your spouse, and you say things that you later regret. You're not saying things like, I'm going to kill you, but you say things that are less than kind. So the question becomes when somebody comes to a doctor and says, my husband physically abuses me, not physically, emotionally abuses me. My husband puts me down. My husband doesn't give me the money that I need. I think there's so much latitude in what's abusive.
Yes.
So I would think that most people that physically abuse their partner also verbally abuse their partner. But not necessarily most people that verbally abuse their partner will physically abuse their partner.
They might not go over that line.
Right.
There's a really strict line.
And I think there are people, I would think most people would draw the line at physical abuse. That
you'd think.
Right.
But so I'm actually really happy you brought this up because there is a difference between, and I talk about this when we go into programs with kids, right? We'll talk about what is the difference between verbal abuse and getting into an argument where things get heated and you say something that you don't mean. And the difference is the intent. So abuse is not, I got angry. We are all guilty of this, right? We get angry in the heat of the moment and we say something and we're like, oh, shoot, I shouldn't have said that. Or man, that was actually really like unkind. And then you apologize and you make up or whatever it is. You own up to what you said. That's what like a normal, mature response to a conflict would be. Abuse is an intentional pattern of behaviors that are used to maintain control and power in the relationship. So it's not like a whoops, I accidentally abused my partner, right? They are very intentionally behaving this way to maintain the upper hand. That could be through verbal, right, things that we were talking about, making them feel less than, making them feel stupid, making them feel worthless. But we often see a pattern with these behaviors. So they will kind of first start with what we call like the honeymoon phase, where things feel good or normal or healthy even. And then we start to build into this tension phase. So that could be increased jealousy or, possessiveness. And then we see the explosive stage, and this is where the abuse might take place. Can be physical, or it can be the emotional or financial or whatever type of abuse. And then immediately following that abuse is, I'm so sorry, please forgive me. I don't know what got into me. I just love you so much and I don't want to lose you. I promise I'll change. I'll get help. And then they're really kind and loving and all the wonderful things again. And then slowly that cycle happens all over again. So it's actually very difficult to see the forest through the trees.
And I think the difficult part is that many of these people are drawn to each other because of this dynamic. Like one person is abusive and the other person takes the abuse, and this becomes their dance. And then at some point in time, the dance becomes too much, and then the one person who's being the victim says enough.
Yeah, I think abusers tend to look for people that are particularly compassionate and forgiving, that are vulnerable to manipulation so that they can kind of maintain that power over them. And people who are victimized, there is no like set, okay, this is a stereotypical victim or stereotypical perpetrator. It really depends.
Although I heard a statistic years ago, and you can say whether or not if you know it's true or not, but I heard that most people that sexually abuse another person were sexually abused as children or young adults.
So yes, and there's a really important asterisk to that. Most people who are sexually abused do not become abusers themselves, but most people who sexually abuse have likely experienced trauma.
Right.
So it's a really important distinction because a lot of people experience sexual violence, but they don't then become perpetrators themselves.
Right.
But there is a correlation with people who then act out in abusive ways because of unprocessed trauma or lots of other things. We see
is there
entitlement, right?
Is there a study that would show what person is more – so let's assume you have 100 people that have been sexually abused. Is there a study that shows these 75 are more likely not to abuse someone and these 25 are very likely to?
Yeah. Off the top of my head, of course, I don't know what – like specific study, but I have seen actually very close to that. It's more so around 80% to 90% are not going to then become abusive themselves.
We also we should talk a little about men, right?
Yes.
You're not the women's center anymore.
Yeah.
You're the all-inclusive center. You're empowering everybody.
Exactly.
So you want to talk a little bit about the men or
Yeah, we actually, unfortunately, we had several cases of men that were experiencing sexual assaults in the last month or so even, that we accompanied to the hospital. There have been situations of men being drugged, and it's really important that people of all identities and backgrounds know that, yes, this can happen and does happen to anyone and by anyone, and that they all deserve the same support and help.
Can I pull the asterisk out here a minute?
Sure.
So I can see how a man could physically abuse another man. Mm-hmm. Do you have situations where women rape men?
Yes. So we can get really technical with this, but our physical, like bodily responses, so if there's a situation of penetration where a woman has raped a man, it could be that the man had some kind of physical arousal, even if he didn't consent to what's happening. So our body's like a knee jerk, right? Our bodies react to things regardless of our emotional response to it. So it is entirely possible, and it does happen, where a man could be physically, their body is physically responding to something, but they don't actually want what is happening and are not consenting to it. There's also other forms of sexual violence and rape. So penetration is one form of sexual violence, and that's typically involving any type of forced or coerced oral sex or anal sex or vaginal sex. So that could be, or penetration, I should say. There's also groping or unwanted touching. So in the state of Connecticut, sexual assault in the 4th degree is touching an intimate part of the body, either over or under clothing, without that person's consent. There's also incest and sexual harassment. So there's lots of different types of sexual violence.
Right. So I would think in a female being raped, they go in and the rape kit is they examine them and they can tell whether or not they have had penetration.
So
how does it work on the male side?
Yeah. So men can get the kit done as well. I'm glad. I was like curious where that was going to go, because a lot of people do think that the kit is like proof that a sexual assault took place, and that's not necessarily the case. It's evidence that's collected that if they decide they want to report it, it helps support their report and their story. Men can get the kit done. Trans people can get the kit done. They examine a lot of different parts of their body. So they'll collect under their fingernails. They will take photographs of any bruises or injuries sustained. They will do anal swabs, vaginal swabs. There's a whole host of different kind of pieces to the kit that's not just for looking for – they can look for, if they have a vagina, they might look for like vaginal tearing and things like that.
No, I'm just talking about the men.
Yeah. So that could be any kind of swabbing. There's an oral swab that they also take as well. So if they were orally penetrated, they can look for DNA there.
Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I'm talking about a biological male with a biological female.
Sure.
So you're not going to have – well, I don't know maybe we're going too far down this road.
That's okay.
So I'm just curious as to, there are situations where a biological man is with a biological female and reports being raped. Mm-hmm. And then I wonder psychologically, how that affects a woman versus a man.
Yeah, I mean, sexual violence.
The shame thing you talked about.
There's so much shame. There's so much shame. There's so much stigma. And it's incredibly underreported. So in general, sexual violence is incredibly underreported, but particularly for male victims and survivors. We don't see them going to the hospital as much, or we don't see them reporting to law enforcement as much. More often they're coming for counseling, and or they're coming months or years later because of the fear of coming forward, the fear of not being, and this is for anyone, right, of any identity. Our cultural response to sexual violence does not lend itself to victims and survivors feeling supported. They often feel like they're being persecuted, or they're being discredited, they're being accused, right, of 15 minutes of fame, whatever it is. So more likely they're not going to come forward regardless of their identity, because they're afraid of not being believed or taken seriously.
And in a domestic, if you have a husband and wife and the wife says, I've been raped, and they don't, the kit will show nothing. The kit will show, yes, they perhaps had sexual intercourse, but then the question is, the only issue is, was there consent? And how do you prove that? Yes,
exactly.
I said, she said yes, he said no, and then it becomes very, very difficult. So I'm sure people are like.
It's super complicated.
Right.
And that's why I think a lot, when people are like, why don't they come forward? Why don't they report it? There's a million reasons why not to report.
Sure.
And very few reasons to. It can be very empowering for survivors to come forward and stake a claim in their story and say, this happened to me, regardless of the outcome, because they know that we can never guarantee justice, right? Or guarantee that that person will serve time or whatever that looks like. And
then you look at the other issues assuming there are kids involved. The woman reports she's been raped by the husband, and then the kids are like, what are you doing? And then the families are going to be like, what are you doing to the family? And there's so many layers of this that become so complicated.
Exactly. And most sexual assaults in general are committed by someone the victim knows, whether that's a family member, a dating partner, or a spouse, or a friend or an acquaintance or a coworker. So they don't, oftentimes what I've seen with clients, They don't want to get that person in trouble. They don't want to ruin their life. Meanwhile, they are left with the lifelong, oftentimes, impacts of that trauma.
Speaking of that, when you get a rape kit done at the hospital, is the hospital obligated to report that if they see something or not?
No.
Yeah, that's what I thought. You
Great
want to talk
question.
About that? Okay.
Yeah, so that's something that we educate clients on as well so that they know their rights with that. So with children, it's very different, right? There's mandated reporting involved when any child is involved in a sexual assault. But for adults, they are not required to report to law enforcement if they go to the hospital. Law enforcement's role when it comes to the kits is they are the guardian of the evidence. So they will come to the hospital to collect the kit once it's been completed, and they are the transporter of that kit to the lab to be tested.
The police.
Correct. Of the location in which the assault occurred. So, for example, Danbury Hospital, I had accompanied a client to the hospital years ago who she was assaulted in New Haven, but she lived in Danbury. So when she came home, she made the decision to go get the kit done. She went to Danbury Hospital, but the New Haven police came to collect the kit once it was completed. But she is not, and no survivor is obligated to report to law enforcement if they don't want to.
So as our time is drawing to a close, I'd like to talk about some feel-good stories. What are some of the things that give you a lot of, that make you feel really good?
Yeah. I'm trying to think back of like specific things. I could probably talk for hours about everything that our advocates do on a daily basis. I mean, just as we were talking before about the day-to-day looks so different depending on what they're responding to. But I think it's easy to look at numbers and say, okay, this is how we can measure success, that this is how many people we served or how many accompaniments we provided. But in reality, it comes down to that individual impact.
Sure.
Our goal is not to say, oh, this person has come to us and now they're healed and they're thriving. Like, we love to see that and we would love to be able to provide that, but that's not the reality. Healing is not linear. And so our goal is to make someone feel less alone, to make sure they know that they feel supported. So I think about a case that I, helped with on the campus at Western Connecticut State University, where we have our satellite office there as well, years ago, who was in an abusive relationship. She was being tormented by her ex-partner. He was stalking her and harassing her. It was physically violent at times, but mostly emotionally controlling, and he would harass her friends, and it was never ending for her. It was this horrible cycle. She decided to go through the judicial process on campus and also file for a temporary restraining order. She obtained the temporary restraining order. He violated it. She would keep working with our advocate at the Danbury Superior Court to get more support there. And eventually he was suspended from the campus as a result of his actions. And she was able to graduate without having to live in constant fear and look over her shoulder. So it's things like that success may not look like always they left the relationship or they reported it to the police, but they felt a little bit safer for a period of time, or they felt less alone.
And I'm hearing that from you, in that you're able to touch so many people in a way that you're saying to them, you're not alone.
Yeah.
We're going to help you.
Exactly.
You can be less afraid than you are currently.
Exactly.
And I think that's magnificent. What a great way to have a job.
Yeah. It's why we do what we do. It's hard to walk away from this type of work once you're in it, because it's not in the sense, a lot of people talk about like teachers being kind of like a thankless job. And so in a lot of ways, being an advocate is similar. You don't always get to see those results. You don't always get to see the thriving part, or they've made it out the other side, but being a part of their journey and being even a small part of that healing, or being that one person. Like, we get all the time people who say, I've never told anyone that this happened to me. You're the first person I've told.
Wow.
And that's so powerful to be able to hold that space for them to feel safe.
So how can people get in touch with you? Your website address is?
Yep, it's thecenterct.org. And then we have our two 24/7 hotlines. So our domestic violence hotline is 203-731-5206. And then our sexual assault hotline is 203-731-5204.
Kara Derling, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. This is great.